Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Today we're going to do another episode of the Memory Lane series, a place where we take a look back at some interesting articles and interviews from old guitar magazines. So my dad has been subscribed to Guitar World magazine for about 30 years now. He saved a bunch of old magazines. He was kind enough to let me borrow some. So the one we're going to look at this time is the January 2006 issue of Guitar World magazine. Here's the cover, and I'm going to share an article with you by Mick Wall about how Metallica's marvelous 1986 album, Master of Puppets, dramatically changed the lives of not only the fans who heard that album, but the band members themselves as well. So let's get started. Here we go. The refinements demonstrated on Master of Puppets showed Metallica as a group that had escaped the thrash ghetto and was now ready for anything. This was no longer metal up your, as they had wanted to call their first album, but rock with its head out on the creative ledge, a phenomenon with very few exceptions not seen in the US charts since the heyday of the 70s. The cohesiveness from one track to the next made perfect sense to us, says Hammett. It was almost as if the album created itself. From the beginning, when we started writing the songs, all the way to the end, really great ideas were just moving and coming out of nowhere in a non-stop flow. It was almost magical, because it seemed like everything we played went right. Every note we played was in exactly the right spot, and it couldn't ever have gone any better. It was just a very, very special time. Holding the album in his hands for the first time, Hammett says he knew Metallica had created something unique and lasting. I remember thinking, wow, this is a great album. Even if it doesn't sell anything, it doesn't matter to me because this is such a great musical statement that we've just created. Having convinced everyone against releasing a single, the songs were too long and they wouldn't get radio play anyway, says Hammett. Metallica hit the road to support Master of Puppets the only way they knew how. We decided to just go on the road and tour until we dropped, says Hammett, which is literally what we did. Despite the album's low chart performance, Metallica were signed up to open Ozzy Osbourne's US tour, which began on March 27, 1986, at the Kansas Coliseum in Wichita. Black Sabbath fans to a man, Metallica were thrilled by the opportunity to tour with Osbourne. Ozzy, for his part, soon became convinced the group was mocking him. All I used to hear coming out of their trailer backstage was old Sabbath albums, he recalls, but as Aldridge says, you gotta remember, we're old Black Sabbath fans. Without Sabbath, there would have been no Metallica. We were definitely in awe when we started out on that tour. Ozzy was a legend to us, but by the end of it, we'd had some good times with him. Of the band's 9-song set list, 4 were from the new album, Battery, which opened the set, Master of Puppets, Welcome Home, Sanitarium, and Damage Inc., which closed the set. Between dates with Osbourne, Metallica played headlining shows at small venues. Thanks to their drive, Master of Puppets began to climb the charts, hitting number 29 on the Billboard Hot 100, despite a complete lack of TV or radio exposure. The album reached number 41 in the UK charts and did well in other countries as well. For the first time, Metallica had shown up on the international radar. Suddenly, whether you had heard the album or not, you were obliged to have an opinion on it. Or on the group itself. A Newsweek reporter on the tour described Metallica as ugly, smelly, and obnoxious. He added, I hate them, but you can't deny their success. In fact, the Ozzy/Metallica US tour was the second biggest ticket-selling draw on the American circuit that summer. Only the Aerosmith/Ted Nugent tour outgrossed them. Sales of Metallica t-shirts also rocketed, a sure sign of success. By the time the US tour ended up at the Coliseum in Hampton, Virginia on August 3rd, Master of Puppets had sold more than 500,000 copies in the US alone, giving the band its first gold record. Master of Puppets brought Metallica to the mainstream, and the mainstream would never be the same. By comparison, bands like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, previously the epitome of hardcore metal, now sounded positively middle of the road. The sense of frustration and anger that permeates Master of Puppets resonated with a new generation of fans who didn't want their rock, rouge, or radio friendly, but hard-edged and uncompromising. Hammett says he was stunned when Master of Puppets went gold. Until then, I had thought, maybe people just don't understand us. Maybe we're doing something that's going over people's heads. But as we went on that Aussie tour, we converted a lot of people night after night, and it gave us a lot of hope to just carry on. Suddenly we were selling albums, and a lot of it had to do with just going out there and playing our off, putting on a great show, just bringing the music to people in that way because radio just wasn't having us. He recalls having a meeting on the back of the tour bus with the band's manager, Cliff Bernstein. He says, "You guys will be able to put down payments on houses. I'm just really proud." A view. And the first thing that Cliff said was, "I want a house where I can shoot my gun that shoots knives." That was such a typical Cliff Burton thing to say. Hang on a second. Okay, let's continue. Perhaps no one embodied the true spirit of Metallica better than Cliff Burton. Although the songwriting cores had always been mainly the preserve of Hetfield and Ulrich, Burton was arguably the group's spiritual figurehead. Hetfield's image had yet to fully develop, while Ulrich's position as the group's de facto spokesman was reserved strictly for offstage pronouncements. Burton, on the other hand, had always cast the longest shadow in Metallica, both on stage and off. Cruelly Master of Puppets, the record that, as Burton said, had been such an achievement for the group, would be his swan song, and its tour his final journey. In early August, Metallica completed its U.S. tour with Osbourne and enjoyed a 5-week break. On September 10th, the European leg of the tour got underway in the UK. Following a celebratory appearance at London's prestigious Hammersmith Odeon Theatre on September 21st, Metallica headed for Sweden, and 3 days later commenced touring in Lund. On September 26th, Metallica appeared at the Saluhallen in Stockholm. The show ended with Burton pummeling out the riffs to Damage Inc. and Blitzkrieg, his right arm windmilling wildly. It had been a good night. Hetfield had been able to play the guitar again for the first time since he had broken his wrist while skateboarding the previous July, and Burton had pulled off a show-stopping bass solo during an improvised and hugely emotional rendering of the Star-Spangled Banner. The mood was high on the tour bus later that night as they hurled down the motorway to Copenhagen, the very city where the album had been born. Earlier that night, the band had drawn cards to decide who got which bunk. Burton drew the ace of spades and got the bunk normally used by Hammett. At just past 5 o'clock that morning, the driver lost control of the bus, which skidded horrifyingly before rolling over into a roadside ditch. Burton was thrown through the glass window nearest his bunk, where he was sleeping, and crushed as the bus collapsed on top of him. A crane was brought into the scene to raise the vehicle, but it was already too late. Cliff Burton was just 24. Ulrich broke a toe, Hammett and Hetfield were badly bruised, and then tour manager Bobby Snyder dislocated his shoulder. Burton was the sole fatality. The bus driver was subsequently arrested by Danish police and charged with manslaughter. He would escape imprisonment and was even rumored to be driving bands around Europe again some years later. Anthrax, who had been the opening act on the tour, had received the news when they arrived in Copenhagen. The next day, Anthrax guitarist Scott Ian summed up his feelings of many. "From the first day that I met him to the last one we spent together in Stockholm, Cliff Burton never changed. Even with Metallica's growing success, he remained the same, really nice guy I first got to know and like. His mode of dress and his manner never altered, and we're all going to miss him terribly. Burton's funeral was held 10 days later in his Northern California hometown of Castro Valley. His bandmates were still in shock. Orion was played at the tearful service, which the band attended along with his friends and devastated family. Cliff's ashes were later spread over Maxwell Ranch, one of his favorite places. There was some talk, initially, that Burton's death would also mean the end of Metallica. Instead, as we now know, the band's post-Burton career was the most unexpected success story. As Kirk said at the time, it wouldn't be fair to just stop. He would have wanted us to go on. That said, it is doubtful Metallica would have become as successful as they did had Burton not died. For one thing, it's impossible to imagine Cliff Burton agreeing to work with Bon Jovi producer Bob Rock, as they did 4 years later on the Black Album, the record that made them superstars. For another, it's entirely plausible that Burton's death spurred Metallica to work harder and reach higher, to hold on to success, even as events conspired to take it from them. 6 weeks after his death, Metallica played their first show with Burton's replacement, former Flotsam and Jetsam bassist Jason Newsted, at the Country Club in Reseda, California. The world tour for Master of Puppets resumed, followed by the release of multi-platinum albums like And Justice for All in 1988, and even more successfully, the Black Album in 1991. By then, it was hard to remember that Metallica had once been a weedy band of thrash-loving headbangers. Yet for many fans, Burton's death represented the loss of the band's identity, even perhaps its soul. Indeed, 20 years on, he still casts such a shadow over the story of Metallica, and specifically Master of Puppets. It has become, above all, Cliff's album, imbued with his uniquely individual personality, unshakable character, sheer courage, wry humor, and deeply held musical beliefs. When Cliff left us, it was a huge loss, says Hammett, in terms of losing a friend, but also in terms of losing a very, very strong musical ally. I mean, he was a large influence on us, not just as a bass player, but also as a musician. He taught me about counterpoint. Cliff was the master of that. It came from his classical influence. He also had a good melodic feel. Hammett says that for a bass player, Burton played a lot of guitar. In fact, he would drive me crazy with it. We'd come back to the hotel after a night of gallivanting, like totally wasted at 3 in the morning. But instead of crashing out, he would immediately want to set up the electric guitars and start playing for a couple of hours. I'd be exhausted, but then I'd totally get sucked into it and start playing along with him. He would talk me into figuring out the guitar parts of certain songs. He was obsessed with Ed King, one of the guitar players in Lynyrd Skynyrd. He also said that Ed King was his favorite guitar player. Hammett maintains that had Metallica made another album with Burton, it would have been extremely melodic. Right before he died, he was listening to Creedence Clearwater Revival, the Eagles, the Velvet Underground, Kate Bush. He listened to a lot of Bach, and he turned us on to R.E.M. At the same time, he was listening to a lot of Merciful Fate, Motorhead, Zeppelin, Hendrix, and Pink Floyd. Plus, he was really into Anthrax, so he really could have gone anywhere with his music. Despite Burton's free-ranging musical taste, Black Sabbath remained his favorite band, and Geezer Butler his favorite bassist. Geezer Butler's right-hand technique, involving just hitting the strings with your fingers, Cliff called it a floppy finger technique, and said he had it too. As Hammett explains, a severed tendon prevented Burton from bending his right-hand pinky. It had no dexterity whatsoever, so he would just use it to hammer the strings and do anything to get a sound out of his bass. Of course, Burton's influence extended beyond the stage, says Hammett. He was the most mature out of all of us. He had a quiet strength, was very, very confident, and the rest of us would defer to him in times of trouble. He just seemed so much wiser and much more responsible than the rest of us. He was the guy who would reprimand us and say, "What the were you thinking?" or "That was a really stupid thing to do." Burton, Hammett says, had a lot of integrity, something he expressed in a stock sentence Hammett uses to this day. It was, "I don't give a..." He was just very, very real. I don't know if he knew somehow that his time was limited, but he really lived it like it was his last day, because he just wouldn't settle for anything other than what he believed in. And that taught me a lot. To this day, there are things, situations that I'm going through, and I can just picture Cliff saying, "What's real to you? What's real to us in this situation? What really matters?" And he would go through a bunch of points that didn't really matter, naming them off, and at the end of each one, he'd say, "I don't give up." He was just a very, very strong guy, stubborn at times, and because of that, he and I would clash sometimes. But we really were just bros. He was just a big influence on us all. As such, Master of Puppets was both a beginning and an ending. You may argue about what those two things are, but one thing is for certain. Metallica would never record another album like it. That's probably why it's still my favorite Metallica album, says Hammett. It was just an amazing time for us. We were putting all the right notes in all the right places. There was no attempt to make an album that would stand the test of time, he says. That wasn't on our radar at all. We just wanted to make the best possible album we could at the time. We really just set our sights to that and buckled down. And we always felt that if we did indeed give it all we had, and it didn't pan out the way we wanted to, at least we could say we tried our best, and that was our attitude. He says that he played the album a day or so beforehand in preparation for our interview. Afterward, he was struck by a thought. If you release this today, it would be right up there with the newest releases in terms of sound, quality, production, concept. It's still relevant. Even the things James was writing about back then are still relevant, and you get the feeling it will all still be relevant tomorrow. I think he's right. That takes us to the end of the article. So, I think if you can take away any moral, any sort of lesson from that article, it would be that sometimes, even though it might not seem like it, sometimes good things can come out of a tragedy. So, rest in peace, Cliff Burton, and rock on Metallica. So, that does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.